Ancient Egyptians considered Osiris to be their god of fertility, life, agriculture, death, and resurrection. Osiris's name meant powerful or mighty, and according to tradition, he was supposed to be Egypt's first pharaoh and king. Osiris was represented by the mythical Bennu bird, which had the power to resurrect itself from ashes. His myth was incorporated into various literary genres and became the most popular and well-known tale in all of Egypt. Let's take a closer look at the myth of Osiris and examine its significance in Egyptian culture. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was born to creator gods Geb and Nut. He was the first king to govern and rule the people of Egypt, and for this reason he was called Lord of the Earth. Osiris reigned for several years together with Isis, who was his queen and companion. Historians believe that Osiris existed as a pre-dynastic deity, as either the ruler of the underworld or a god of fertility and growth. These pre-existing stories and tales were eventually amalgamated into one coherent text called the Myth of Osiris. The myth of Osiris was transmitted from generation to generation for millennia, but took on an entirely new form when the Greeks colonized Egypt. The Greeks adapted the myth into their own context and merged the story of Osiris with that of the bull god Apis. As a result, a syncretic deity was born under the name of Serapis. During the reign of Ptolemy I, Serapis became the chief god and patron of Alexandria. In Egyptian art, Osiris was almost exclusively depicted as a youthful man with black or green skin. The green skin was to represent his deceased status, as well as his association with rebirth. Osiris wore the Yetef, or crown of Upper Egypt, on his head, and carried a crook and flail in his arms, which were usually crossed in the typical mummy fashion. In some depictions, Osiris was also portrayed as a mythical ram known as Banabjed. Images on tombs and burial chambers showed Osiris as a partial mummified being, signifying his crucial role as a king of the underworld. Osiris was represented by several symbols. These included the crook and flail, Egypt's foremost symbols of royal power and authority, which also represent the agricultural fertility of the land. The Yetef crown, which features the Hedjet with an ostrich feather on either side. The so-called Dedjet pillar, an important symbol of stability and power, also believed to represent the spine of Osiris. Ostrich feathers, which signified truth and justice and symbolize his role as a just and truthful ruler. Mummy gauze, which refers to his role as a god of the underworld. His green skin, which represented his association with agriculture, rebirth, and vegetation. And finally, his black skin, which signified the fertility of the Nile River Valley. But what Osiris is mostly known for are the myths, especially the myth of Osiris and Set, which had different versions over time. The main story describes Osiris as the first king of Egypt. He was a successful king who introduced civilization and agriculture into the provinces. After doing so, he went on a long journey away from Egypt with his sister and consort Isis. After a few months, when the brother and sister returned to their kingdom, they were met by a fierce challenge. Osiris's brother Set was ready to usurp the throne, and their return hindered his plans. To prevent Osiris from ascending the throne, Set slew him and mutilated his body, chopping him up into little pieces. Isis and her son Horus decided to avenge the dead king. There was a mighty battle, but eventually Horus defeated Set. Isis then collected all of Osiris's body parts and buried them, but she kept aside his phallus, made replicas of it, and distributed them across Egypt. The replicas became important locations of shrines and centers of worship all over the Egyptian kingdom. However, there are other versions of this famous myth, one of which explains the reasons for Set's grudge against his own brother. When he was a king of all Egypt, Osiris was reportedly a remarkable ruler. However, his brother Set was always jealous of his powers and abilities. Set became even more envious when his own consort, Nephthys, fell in love with Osiris. An enraged Set couldn't contain his anger and murdered Osiris by attacking him in the form of a beast. Other accounts claim that it was by drowning him in the Nile River. Set, however, didn't stop at murder, and he further dismembered Osiris's body to assure himself of the king's demise. He then scattered every piece of the god's body in different places of the country. Isis gathered all of Osiris's body parts and put together the body of Osiris with the help of Nephthys. She then was able to resurrect him long enough to have intercourse with him. Isis then gave birth to Horus, who became the rival of Set and the rightful heir to the throne. To make things even more confusing, there is yet another version of the Osiris myth involving the Mediterranean town of Byblos. In this version, Set murdered Osiris by tricking him into a coffin and pushing him into the Nile River. The coffin floated to the land of Byblos, where it was grounded. The king of Byblos came across the coffin during one of his travels. However, he couldn't recognize it as a coffin since a tree had grown around the wood. The king of Byblos took the tree back to his kingdom, and his carpenters carved it into a pillar. The pillar, along with Osiris's hidden coffin, remained in the palace of Byblos until the arrival of Isis. When Isis reached Byblos, she appealed to the king and queen to extract the coffin from the pillar and get back her husband's body. The king and queen complied, but Set came to know of this plan and quickly obtained Osiris's body. He cut up the body into several pieces, but Isis was able to put it back and impregnate herself with Osiris's phallus. Although there are several versions of the myth of Osiris, the basic elements of the plot remain the same. Set murders his brother and usurps the throne. Isis then avenges Osiris's death by giving birth to Horus, who then challenges Set and reclaims the throne. The myth of Osiris symbolizes a battle between order and disorder. It conveys the idea of Ma'at, or the natural order of the world. This balance is constantly disrupted by unlawful acts such as Set usurping the throne and murdering Osiris. However, the myth conveys the idea that evil can never reign for long, and Ma'at will eventually be restored. This myth has also been used as a symbol of the cyclic process of birth, death, and afterlife. Osiris, as a god of the afterlife, has come to symbolize rebirth and resurrection. Due to this, many Egyptian kings have identified themselves with the Osiris myth in order to ensure reincarnation through their descendants. The myth has also reiterated the importance of being a virtuous, benevolent, and noble king. For the Egyptians, the myth of Osiris was also an important symbol of life and fertility. The floodwaters of the Nile River were associated with the bodily fluids of Osiris. The people assumed that the flood was a blessing from Osiris and enabled a rich growth of plant and animal life. The myth of Osiris first appeared in the pyramid text during the Old Kingdom, but the most complete account of the myth only appeared several years later in the Great Hymn of Osiris. The myth was also reimagined in a humorous way in the Contendings of Horus and Set, written during the 20th dynasty. However, it was the ancient Greek and Roman writers who compiled the myth into a coherent whole and formulated a complete account of the details. Therefore, much of what we know today comes from the various insights of ancient Greek and Roman writers. Osiris was a widely worshipped god, and there were festivals held in his honor. The Fall of the Nile Festival and the Djad Pillar Festival celebrated the death and resurrection of Osiris. One of the most important rituals in these festivals was the planting of seeds and crops. Men and women would dig up several beds of soil and fill them with seeds. The growth and germination of these seeds symbolized the return of Osiris. In these festivals, long dramas were enacted and performed based on the myth of Osiris. These dramas would usually end with the rebirth and resurrection of the king. Sometimes people would make models of Osiris using temple-grown wheat and water to signify his rise from the dead. Osiris, the righteous king who died tragically and was resurrected thanks to the love of his wife Isis, is the quintessential figure of Egyptian kingship. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be direct descendants of Osiris, and if not, they wanted to demonstrate that they were worthy of his throne. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about other gods of Egyptian mythology, hit the like button and please consider subscribing to our channel. To receive regular updates on our videos and news, click the notification button, and as always, thank you very much for watching.